Having spent 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade attending Ebenezer Elementary School across the street from the town's museum in the Hamlet of Ebenezer, you could imagine just how much the name came up in my daily life, and still does, as it's where I moved back to in 2014 after spending close to 15 years in New England and Northern California. This place is really special no matter what you stack it up against, and it all started with this little known and often misunderstood group of folks who settled into the region in the early 1800s. Jim Pace is the West Seneca town historian, and he was gracious enough to take some time and tell me the Cliff Notes version of their tale, so I could share it with all of you.
Well, actually, we're standing in an Ebenezer home right now, which is the current West Seneca Historical Society Museum. The Ebenezers, as they're known, was actually the name they got from the community name. The Ebenezer was the municipal name of this area, but their true name is the Gemeinde der wahren Inspiration, or the Community of True Inspiration. They were from mostly German-speaking countries in Central Europe, also Holland and Switzerland. And they were primarily a Lutheran religious sect that wanted to go back to more of the church founding fathers' way of worship. They didn't like the liturgical elements that were creeping into the church, and they wanted to go back to more of a prophecy-based religion. They also had some very unusual political ideas. They did not believe in swearing any oaths of allegiance to any of the rulers in Europe. They didn't want to send their children to established Orthodox schools, which were mostly run by the Orthodox churches, established churches. They didn't want to pay taxes. They didn't want to serve in the military. These are things that get you in trouble. And so they were persecuted in Europe. I'm talking when they started around the 1700s. They struggled for quite a period of time in Europe, traveling from place to place. Germany at that time was not a united country. There were different principalities there. And so they would find out, well, this particular duke or this particular prince might be more lenient. Let's try this area of Europe. Let's go to Bavaria. Let's go to Baden-Baden. And they would move around like that to try to avoid persecution and penalties, fines, taxes, even penalties as far as floggings when they refused to follow certain rules. Their neighbors also didn't appreciate their lifestyle. There were incidents of them being stoned, neighbors throwing things at them personally and at their houses. And so after about 100-some years of this persecution and traveling around, their leader at this particular time, this is in the mid-1800s, who was known as the Werkzeug in German, or the tool or mouthpiece of God, had an inspiration. And during one of the church services, he was filled with the Spirit of God. He spoke in a different timbre of voice. He would close his eyes and basically made a prophecy that it was time to leave Europe and travel to across the sea to North America. This was in the 1840s. And so the word of God said that you will take several others with you of the church elders and scout out some new lands. And that's how they ended up coming to North America. How they ended up in this particular area is another interesting part of their story. The couples, the elders with the Werkzeug, whose name was Christian Metz, traveled a very difficult ship travel across the Atlantic, ended up in New York City, talked to some land agents there that found out that, very interestingly, in 1842, a treaty had just been signed with the Native Americans in upstate New York, and this big, huge area of land was open that had been known as the Buffalo Creek Reservation. So they promptly went up the Hudson River, came across the Erie Canal to western New York, got into some contact with some agents here, and came out to this area, right here in West Seneca, which was the center of the Buffalo Creek Reservation and the most populated area because of all the natural resources, the creeks that came through here, the rich farmland, a lot of game, timber. And so the Ebenezers that came here, the scouting party, if you will, loved it. They loved the area. They checked another place out in Chautauqua County, didn't like it as much. And this was in the winter, by the way, kind of hard to get around here then. But despite the wintry conditions, they saw that this would work out well for them. And so they purchased 5,000 acres at $10 an acre, which pretty much outlines current West Seneca, right in the middle of the Buffalo Creek, or the former Buffalo Creek Reservation. And again, the interesting thing about this is Christian Metz received this divine inspiration in 1842 in Europe, the same time that the Buffalo Creek Compromise Treaty of 1842 was signed here. I don't think he knew that, but somehow or other, those two time frames came together, and they ended up purchasing the land here that would become their colony. And then they sent word back, and then the people started coming over 10 at a time, 50 at a time, 100 at a time, so you had about 1,000 people that settled in this area. They transformed it completely. There are a few scattered Indian cabins and an enterprise, a sawmill that they inherited or took over. But then they started to build their own. And their idea was to be in the world, but not part of the world. So everything they did was self-contained, to the extent that at this time they became communalists. All their property was owned in common. The only thing they owned personally were their own clothing and their household items. Otherwise, everything was in common. The houses, the agriculture productions, the industries that they started were all common enterprises. The money stayed within the community, because this is just a transition in life, the transition to ultimately heaven, the next world. That was the true purpose of their existences. So they're very productive. They did everything themselves that they could. I mean, manufacturing, tools, the machine shops, clock shops even, as well as their agricultural enterprises, which were very extensive. So within a very short period of time, this whole area was transformed into very booming communities. And they named it Ebenezer, which comes from the Old Testament. It's an Old Testament expression, comes from the book of Samuel. And Samuel placed a rock between Mizpah and Shen and called the rock Ebenezer, meaning from henceforth hath the Lord helped us. That's where that name came from. And they became known then as the Ebenezers, because that was the name of the community here. So after they established the community of Ebenezer, it was actually three communities. There was Mittel Ebenezer, Nieder Ebenezer, and Ober Ebenezer. Middle Ebenezer, Lower Ebenezer, Upper Ebenezer. They finally melded together into one village called Ebenezer. And then eventually in 1851, they decided that there was enough people here under New York state law to actually create a town rather than a village. So they named a town, they incorporated the town through New York state laws as the town of Seneca. Well, they found out a little bit later that there is a town of Seneca. It's in the Finger Lakes. And so the following year in 1852, it was renamed to West Seneca, because we're west of the original Seneca. That's where we got our name. But what happened was, after a few years, some problems started to occur here. One was they started to overcrowd. I mean, they were all coming into this area. They were running out of more land to purchase. Other settlers were coming into this first Ebenezer and then West Seneca that were not part of this religious community. And as much as they tried to keep separate, it was becoming impossible. Then on top of all of this, you had the proximity of the city of Buffalo, especially the Canal Zone. Today, we find it hard to believe how rough things were back in those days in the Canal Zone, because you go down to the Canal Zone and you have your ice cream cone and you go on your little boat trips. But back then, it was a vile, very sinful place in the eyes of the Ebenezers, and very close to here. So it was decided they had to go further away, had to get out of here. So they started to sell their properties here and moved all the way out to Amana, Iowa, where their descendants still live to this day. They are no longer communalists. In the 1940s, they abandoned this communalist form of ownership, and they own private property. They still conduct one service in their churches in German, and they still maintain some of their traditions. And their traditional German industrial skills are apparent, because they created the Amana Appliance Company while they were there. But they finally pulled out incomplete by about the 1860s, mid-1860s. Pretty much they were gone from this area. And so they're a very short period of time, about 20 years, complete transformation of this area from a very rural, rustic, Indian-inhabited reservation to a thriving a village, a series of villages with agricultural and industrial pursuits, and then they left. Now, fortunately, there are still about 50 buildings in town that are still standing that were built by the Ebenezer Society, not only this museum, but others throughout the town. So they've left that legacy. And the one thing that kind of is unique about West Seneca is we have this combination legacy of the Native Americans, which everybody else has, plus this religious sect from Germany, which nobody else has. So it's very interesting. There were some problems, by the way, when they first came here, because the land agent that handled the deal kind of fell down on it and didn't have the proper paperwork here. And some of the natives that were living here, primarily Senecas, said, well, let's see this treaty, let's see this sale. And the Ebenezers asked the land agent, well, we need to see it too. And it wasn't there. They couldn't produce it. So there was a problem there for a little while because this treaty wasn't clear. But then the Ebenezers heard of a very sharp lawyer in the city of Buffalo named Millard Fillmore, who helped them out, put some heat on the land agent, and they produced the sale, and so it was official. Because the Ebenezers put everything they had into this. All their monies, all their supplies, everything came here. They had no place to fall back to. So if that land sale had fallen through, they would have been in trouble. But it was all worked out, and actually the Senecas that remained had very amiable agreements with the Ebenezers when they left.
Well, that's about it for this episode of the Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember to support the small towns of Western New York in any way you can. They're full of great businesses and people who'd love to see you in their towns. The Small Town Western New York Companion Podcast, the TV series, is a presentation of Discovering Western New York and A.A. Augustine Media Co. and can be found everywhere you listen to your favorite podcasts. Thanks for listening.